Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are joining us from. Welcome to the 23rd International Development Seminar Series at the Open University. We welcome you, and today we have Jessica Giles, who is going to speak about a very, very interesting topic, given the developments, particularly in the space sector over the past decade or so. So maybe a bit of some house rules here, just to let you know that the event will be recorded. And if there's anyone who wish to remain anonymous, please do leave and retain using an incognito tab, which allows you to change the username to anonymous. Again, if you are interested in the work that we are doing at the Open University in International Development, you are most welcome to follow us on Twitter, which is @int development_OU. And Heidi will be the one managing that. And please, if you have any questions during the presentation, please, you're most welcome to pop them as well in the chat box, and then we'll pick them up after Jessica's presentation. For a start, I think we have muted all the mics, and guest cameras as well cannot be switched on except for Jessica and me. But during the Q&A session, we are going to open this, and you'll be able to conversate with us with your videos on. So today we have Jessica Giles, who is a qualified barrister and solicitor and senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. She has been working full-time in academia since 2013 for the Open University Law School. She has a dual scholarship of teaching and learning and research portfolio, with her research focusing on the intersection between law, theology, and religious studies. I think from 2011 to 2022, she has been an associate editor for the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion, where I think she had a very interesting piece of publication looking at interdependence, particularly on the concept of rule of law and religious freedoms. But today she's coming to talk to us about a very, very interesting topic now, which is, I think, looking at first exploration, but in this case, looking or using a theological perspective. Without further ado, then I'd like to welcome Jessica to talk to the colleagues.
Thank you, Frangton. That's really kind. And it's lovely to see everyone who's here, and welcome to everyone who listens to the recording and joins us later. I'm going to do a screen share, so if you just bear with me while I pull up my PowerPoint presentation. Here we go. Can everyone see that all right?
We can, Thanks, Jessica.
Great, good. Okay, so let me get the... That's it. There we go. So today what I'd like to do is I'm going to provide a brief overview of the topic I'm going to cover with you. I'll spend about 45 minutes on the presentation, and then I would love to engage with you in some dialogue around some of the ideas that I present to you. First of all, I'm going to just briefly give an overview of why I look at law and theology. That's topics these days, or subjects these days, that you don't regularly see synthesized together or explored together, but I'll just explain the rationale behind what I do and a little bit about the methodology I use for doing that. Then I'm going to outline some theological concepts that are relevant to my understanding that I've gained of the law on space and space exploration. So those theological concepts are prophecy, the Garden of Eden, and community and stewardship. I'll also look at Bethin Bowen's idea of original sin. He has a book that's just come out, Original Sin, Power, Technology and War in Outer Space. So I'll have some reflections on some of the things he has to say. Next, I'll look at the law as it pertains to space and space exploration and activities in space. And it'll be a very brief overview. There's a wonderful module we have in the law school, W260, a level 2 module, which, well, half of that looks at space law. So you can imagine the extent of the law and the extent of time I would need to cover all that law. But what I want to do is have a look at some of the principles underlying that law and consider how they relate to some of my theological concepts that I've introduced. I'll then briefly have a look at some of the theological implications, or the legal implications as well, of the analysis I've undertaken and give some concluding thoughts. So we have some incredible experts at the OU, both in law and in STEM and in international development, who've worked on space. And all I've done here, for those of you who'd like the slides available, I've put in some of the open learn resources that we already have in terms of some of the science that's going on and the law as it applies to planetary protection. Thomas Cheney, my colleague, has created a short open learn course there. So one of the dangers of interdisciplinary research is that one has something of an imposter syndrome. One comes into various disciplines. So my training is in law and I have a certain level of training within that. But when one starts to undertake a synthesis, of course, one finds one is in the company of experts, whether that's theologians, experts in religious studies, or experts in the science of astrobiology, astrophysics, astronomy, those sorts of things. So much of what I do is about bringing the specialisms that I have within theology and within law, looking at that intersection and then seeing law through a theological lens, and in this case, seeing the law of space through a theological lens. If you have expertise in the fields, particularly STEM colleagues, those of you who have expertise in the field, will, I hope, feel free to criticize me or engage with me in terms of the science. Science isn't my expertise. I have a passion for science fiction, which was a childhood passion, but that's as far as it goes. So I am completely open to ideas, thoughts, and being told what's what from colleagues who are far more experienced. The idea of what I do is to start a dialogue, particularly around the ethics and ideas and frameworks that inform our law creation and the adjudication of law. And I look at that from a plural perspective and a multivalent perspective. So the idea being, particularly in democracies, but elsewhere, if we are going to create a law that is acceptable to people, it's going to be informed by various different approaches. So a lot of this is about starting a dialogue. So why do I choose law and theology? Where does that come from and what is that synthesis? I think it's axiomatic, really, that law creation and adjudication is based on or relies on systems of thought and conscience. We don't create law in a vacuum and we don't resolve cases in a vacuum. We always need to have a plumb line, if you like, of an ethical system that's built on, in democracies, a consensus within society, which informs the directions we go in. And so we have a spectrum under the law of systems of thought and conscience, which incorporate the religious or the very religious. We see some states that have Saudi Arabia, for example, would be based on Islam and the Islamic tradition. We see other states with a strong Christian influence, a strong Hindu influence, or we see other states which would claim a philosophical basis, which would attempt to steer clear from any religious influence on law creation and law adjudication. But regardless of that basis, there is that ethical system that informs how the law is made. So what we also see, and research tells us, so the Pew Research Centre, Jonathan Fox, Grace Davey, Putnam and Campbell to name a few authors, inform us that despite the predictions of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinking, religion is still very much alive for over 80% of the globe. So 80% of people in the world adhere to some form of faith or another. And the implication of that, it seems to me, is that the other 20% will be influenced by that thinking and those frameworks created out of that faith. Individuals, of course, will be pursuing their ethical frameworks for their individual lives, even where they live within a wider framework which might not necessarily accord to their particular faith-based ethical frameworks. So the dangers of failing to account for religion are therefore fairly high. We can imagine that individuals will suffer themselves, will suffer cognitive dissonance, where a government or institutions are creating laws and rules which sit on an ethical framework or are based on principles which are far removed from their own. And the extremes of that, I think, is we create cultures of exclusion where we say these are the rules that are made by our government, and actually we don't really care what your group thinks or care what your group thinks. You know, this is what we're creating as a government. So it's really, really important, I think, for our public living together and our peaceful living together, that we do account for faith. And that really is fundamentally why I look in my own research at a Christian theological approach that's dialogical, so it invites dialogue with other faiths to inform law creation and law adjudication, both about the constitutional structures, how we create the laws that under which we live as a society, but also I look specifically at types of law, so in this instance, space law. Western liberal democracy, of course, is predicated on plural living together, which includes religious beliefs. And I think we've had a bit of a crisis in that regard in recent years, and we are slowly coming out of that as people become more confidently religious and are more confident about the fact that if we're religious in public life, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will deteriorate into factionalism and strife. When we look at global living together, I think global living together is about more than mere tolerance. It is important that we have understanding. One example of that, which is proving particularly challenging at the moment, I think, is Qatar and the football, the World Cup that's going on there, and the differences we're seeing in living together and the challenges that poses where our frameworks and our understandings are at odds. And I think we have to learn somehow to understand, to talk about that, to dialogue around that, and to work our way through that. So my approach then is more than accommodation and tolerance. It's about thinking through legal frameworks that are informed by multiple systems of thought, conscience, and religion. So this multivalent approach to informing our law creation and adjudication. This, I think, applies just as much to space as well on outer space, that is, as well as on Earth. My own approach, as I've said, is dialogic and theological. It's based in Christian Reform theology. It stems from Calvinism and is based in Dutch Reform thinkers such as Kuyper and de Weert. It was then picked up in America by Protestant thinkers there. The methodology I use is an integrative research process. And it's an iterative design and redesign in response to the identification of an issue or problem. And it's generally speaking what the problem itself, what isn't soluble within one particular discipline. So when I look at space law, for example, and take on board the theological lens to look at that, the methodologies I apply within the disciplines within law is the method of doctrinal methodology of analysing law and comparative approaches. I take a comparative approach to law, and within theology it's a book-based analysis of doctrines and theories. The synthesis and analysis is about bringing the law and theology together to better understand the issue from both perspectives. And the analysis and development is about the creation of new knowledge. So that's what makes it interdisciplinary as opposed to multidisciplinary. In order to create rigor within the disciplines, what I look to do is to ensure there's rigor within the individual methodologies applied within law and theology. And then at the synthesis stage, once I've created an analysis, a synthesis, I then go out to a variety of audiences within the disciplines and in an interdisciplinary environment to test those theories and understand whether I meet the rigor or the standards set by the individual disciplines. So what I've done here is I've briefly provided the methodological approach that I work from. It's Toby and Camben in the Netherlands created this, both for their own interdisciplinary research and their teamwork, but also they do fantastically. They work with a group of students and they put them in groups, so they're interdisciplinary groups of students, and they ask them on the module that they're taking as part of their research to identify a research issue and work together with this framework to develop methodologies, look at the issues and come out with proposals, so synthesize knowledge. So there's a conceptual design stage, a technical design stage, an execution stage, and an integration and report stage. I have presentations I do on how I do that in more detail, and I'm not going to spend time on that now, but I just wanted to give you a window into the methodological approach. So what then of my theological concepts? So the first concept I'd like to look at with you is the concept of prophecy. I take a Christian theological approach, as I explained, that is not exclusive. So prophecy sits within other traditions as well. And I would, in my research process, and as I go to conferences and as I engage with academics, I would seek to identify and dialogue with their understanding of prophecy and where that takes us in relation to informing space law. So from my own Christian theological perspective, we have biblical text which help us to better understand what we mean by prophecy. And a very brief summary of all that. We also have some commentators on that within the theological tradition, various theological traditions, but the summary of that for these purposes, a person who communicates the will or warning of the divine for the admonishing, protection and flourishing of humankind. So not all traditions would see the role of prophet as a modern role. They would understand prophecy as within the biblical canon, but other traditions see individuals today as having prophetic capacity, and certainly within the Christian Reformed theory of common grace, which is something I look at, this would understand individuals within and outside the Christian tradition as having the capacity of prophecy, to play the role of prophet. And my view is that within academia, we have a particular and special calling to play something of that prophetic role in society. We have what to me is a luxury and joy of time to explore and analyze and read about and have a view onto the potential futures that we might see coming. We can look into the past, we can look at the future, we can warn, we can change the course, if you like, of a particular policy area. And I think all that leads into the prophetic. So what about the other aspects of the role of prophecy? One of the aspects, of course, is to call people back to the divine, and that I think has a particular role within space exploration and space law. But even beyond that and outside that, there is a role of teaching, interpreting, cajoling, encouraging, chastising, denouncing injustice and idolatry, and foreseeing and anticipating coming events. For those of you who've read, some of you might have read it, but Blethin Bowen, I don't know whether you can see me here, you can probably just see my screen. Blethin Bowen has published a really interesting book on, it's called Original Sin, Power, Technology and War in Outer Space. And I think he is an example in that text of someone who is undertaking something of a prophetic role. There is some further work, I think, that needs to be done on his conceptualization of original sin and what's going on in space. So I think he needs to expand the theological understanding of original sin, look at the idea of redemption, and also the idea of just war. He doesn't really touch on either of those topics. And I think his analysis needs to sit in the bigger picture of what is in fact the good that is coming out of space and what's going on in space. And his criticism that it's naive optimism to think only positively about space, I think needs to be heeded, but I wouldn't go as far as to say it's all doom and gloom. However, what he does do, and I think where he carries out a prophetic role, is he looks at the way in which satellite technology has been used to militarize space and the impact that's having on Earth. So he looks at dual use of telecommunication and reconnaissance satellites, leading to dominance on Earth by those states which have dominance of the lower Earth orbit and geostationary orbit in the use of satellites, particularly geostationary orbit. He also looks at the fact that there was destruction of indigenous lands in order to create capacity for space exploration. And he looks at the idea of the blurred private and corporate and military lines in what's going on in space. So I think there's a lot there. It's a brilliant book, and there's a lot there to take on board for those of you who are interested in exploring that further. I think also there is prophetic capacity in our astrophysicists, astrobiologists and astronauts. And increasingly what we're going to see, I think, is this disenfranchisement of those who don't understand or have the ability to, technological ability to move into this area. So we have the most phenomenal academics at the OU who have created these open learn modules, which enables them to speak more generally to the public and to others of us that don't understand those technical details, to really start getting to grips with some of the ideas and what's going on, and to heed warnings about what might be going on in the future. So some aspects of that, to break that down a bit further: satellite technology. It can be used for so much good, and it can also be misused. So we need to listen to the experts on that, I think. Observing other planets, some of the scientific discovery that's going on other planets is teaching us about our own history and development, potentially, but also about our own potential futures, what might happen to us if we don't heed the warnings about climate change and things like that. Astronauts are seen as envoys of humankind, and then we also see ideas about multiplanetary activity and potential multiplanetary settlement. So I think there's aspects of hope and a future, and the idea of human flourishing built in there. And then we see around astro-environmentalism. It's a wonderful topic, and my colleague Thomas Cheney in the law school has a specialism in this area. So the idea here is that do we, and if so, how do we protect outer space as an environment? And there's some really interesting ethical issues around there that we need to be listening to and learning from the experts on that. What about this intersection then of prophecy and space? I've just put a few examples in here because I want to cover some other theological concepts. But there is a strong role of teaching, learning, cajoling and chastising, for example, when we look at climate change, the ozone layer, for example, and the work we've done on that. Already we are seeing a response to what I would say is a prophetic role of those who have control of satellites and are identifying issues. So our amazing scientists. The ability to denounce injustice and spot what's going on. So the terrible expulsion of Rohingyas from Myanmar back in, I think it was 2015, 2016, there was the ability to see what was going on as it was happening and get support in there and try and help the individuals and that community as a whole. And then the next topic I want to look at briefly, but I've got a whole slide for that because I think it's such an important one, is AI and quantum computing. So NASA has a quantum artificial intelligence laboratory, and it's the Space Agency's hub for assessing the potential of quantum computers to impact computational challenges faced by the agency in the decades to come. Now, I don't know if anyone like me was an Isaac Asimov fan, and I spent my childhood in his Foundation series books, and there he talks about psychohistory, this idea that artificial intelligence and the potential to compute data can give us a prophetic capacity into the future. What we have at the moment is the power of AI to predict, based on certain data fed into it, what is likely to come. And if there are scientists here, please correct me. It's my limited understanding, but from the reading I've done, what I understand is to come is when we see AI and quantum computing combined, we will have machine learning not based on human programming. So what we'll be seeing technically is the machine as a prophet. And I think this raises a whole host of questions, particularly in relation to the role of and the relationship between the individual and the divine, and the role of an individual as in humankind, an individual within humankind as a prophetic. So the jump I make to get to my proposals at the end, but which I'll refer to briefly here, is this then must make us think about how we protect religious freedom and freedom of speech within that context. So as we look to developments in AI and quantum technology, and particularly as we combine that with space travel, what are we doing to protect religious freedom and to protect freedom of speech, both in the context of outer space and in the context of what we do on Earth in relation to outer space? So I think this is about more than signs and symbols and places of worship. It's about protecting faith, both in God and in technology and scientific advances. You know, we are tasked, I think, and I'll look at stewardship in a minute, we are tasked with developing scientific knowledge and more understanding. But that seems to me, that mustn't come at the cost of our understanding or our theological understandings of the divine and our relationship to the divine. So the other implication from that, I think, is we have to think about what are the limits of law, and when do we need to be creative? So I think we need to sometimes think beyond law and look at what's going on and think about the ethics of what's going on, and in terms of relationships and how our science is developing, what tools are we using in order to inform and protect what we have, but encourage a future. So my next concept I'd like to look at is the concept of the Garden of Eden. So this finds a place certainly within the Abrahamic religions. We see that in biblical texts in Genesis and Ezekiel. Often when we see this pictured, we see paradise as a garden, and we just see it as a garden. And sometimes we'll have the picture of the tree and Eve picking the apple and Adam eating the apple. But I think if we're to look at it theologically, the Garden of Eden is about much more than that. And banishment from the Garden of Eden means more than just a loss of a beautiful environment. The Garden of Eden, I think, can also be perceived as relational. So the relationship between Adam and Eve and the relationship between humankind and God. There was a certain perfection to that relationship in the Garden of Eden, and there was something lost to that when we were banished, when the banishment came. The Garden of Eden is also a resource. So Adam and Eve were put in the garden to live from the produce within the Garden of Eden and live contentedly. And the Garden of Eden was under the command of God. So if we take those concepts and think about outer space and the way in which it might inform what's going on, and I'll look later at the law and how that might provide a relational framework, because of course law for us on earth in our communities frames how we relate to each other in public life or in our work relationships, and in multiple other ways. So what we have in outer space then is virgin territory. We had that in the Garden of Eden. Also, there is this similarity that we have humankind with responsibility for care and protection of an environment, and the ability to live harmoniously and steward resources. So the legal framework, which I'm going to come on to, that covers outer space has incredible levels of collaboration over and above what we see on Earth. We don't see such high levels of compliance and collaboration in international law. It's more aspirational on Earth, if you like, whereas when we go into outer space, we see far higher levels of compliance with it. So I think there's an achievement of an international peaceful space in outer space that we don't see on Earth. Levels of unseen cooperation and collaboration that has echoes of a Garden of Eden. I think we can only take the analogy so far, but the analogy is helpful when we think about whether we're about to bite the apple or we have bitten the apple, and that we might be banished from the Garden of Eden, so we might lose what we have. It also might help us understand this idea of how we relate to each other. Some of the law is relationally supportive, so relations between nation states in outer space bear a resemblance to that which has this kind of Garden of Eden-like state. So Bowen, I think, would argue that it's too late. We've already bitten the apple. The militarization or the use of satellites for military purposes, and the original use of space, because it was created out of the arms race between America and Russia, so that original sin, has had the effect of meaning that we didn't even start in the Garden of Eden. I think Thomas Cheney, my colleague, would perhaps say that, well, can we think of space as an environment even? Is it a Garden of Eden? You know, we look at some of the inhospitable planets and what's going on out there, and would it take that analogy too far? And what are the ethical implications of space travel, research and planetary settlements? And how might astro-environmentalism inform law creation? So I think beyond that as well, the interrelationship between humankind and space. So how are we looking at this? If we think of the Garden of Eden as a relational space and a space that was protective of relationships, how can we help that to inform and support the ongoing collaboration within space? And how do we see the idea of the Garden of Eden as a driver for scientific research, or do we see it merely as a resource to be exploited? So in terms of my own position, I think we can usefully ask, are we currently biting the apple? And as I work through this presentation, I'll identify why I think that might be the case. One of the reasons, though, just to present a few of my ideas here. So there is indeed, I agree with Bowen, there is indeed an impact on Earth of technology that's in geostationary orbit and lower Earth orbit. So we do see the harnessing of that technology for military purposes. But I would weigh that against the fact that we have outer space beyond those orbits, which is actually has, in terms of its legal framework, that supports relational interactions between states and individuals in outer space. We still do have something of that Garden of Eden approach. So I think we're fraying at the edges and probably in the process of eating the apple, and we have a chance to stop eating it, if you like, to take the analogy perhaps a little bit further. One of the problems, and the big problems pointed out in the literature, is of course that the global north has such control in outer space, and certainly of geostationary orbit. The lower Earth orbit, the orbit closest to Earth in which objects can sit, is more accessible now. But of course, the sums of money required to send missions into outer space can make that prohibitive. And there are attempts to include the global south, but we're still far from having an equitable approach. In my own research as well, I look at this idea not just of democratization to include additional state actors from across the globe, but I think we need to start looking more at democratization in terms of individual engagement and the informing of individual views, plural views, into what's going on in space. So my next concept I want to look at is the concept of community. So faith supports and exists in community. So we see that both in the Old and the New Testament, as the people of Israel, wider family and tribes, and a people fleeing from Egypt are supported as a community. And then in the New Testament, Jesus and the disciples and the Christian church throughout all the ages. Of course, we see also in other faiths, and we can look around us in modern times and see how faiths create community. There's some wonderful research undertaken by Brian Grimm in America, and he looks in fact at the contribution that various faiths play to the American economy, and it's massive. It's bigger than some of the top tech companies, and there is a huge contribution that faith communities make in all sorts of ways to our living together on Earth. And I think this concept is very useful when we take it into space. We already see that it's a sphere of outstanding collaboration. So we have the International Space Station, for example, where we have countries collaborating and working together. They all built various bits of it, and astronauts go into space from these various countries and elsewhere. And there's an incredible level of collaboration there and community building. Space exploration is for the benefit of humankind, so it belongs to no one but everyone. Astronauts are viewed as envoys of humankind, so while they carry their flag, as it were, and the law of their state follows them into space, so how it works is that objects in space are governed by the law of the country that sends them up into space, and astronauts carry the flag of the country they are launched from, because the sending country has to take ongoing responsibility for their action in space. But we see when what goes on in space is we see this community building and collaboration that's absolutely phenomenal in ways that we don't see so much on Earth. We also see the capacity of telecommunications and global navigation to create community, build community, and support community on Earth. So we see that kind of impact of what's going on in space down on Earth. So at the intersection of community and space, we see a living example of collaboration and supportive of community. And I think also I would suggest that Rowan Williams's theology of rights is really helpful here in envisaging this community, not of individual claim rights, but of holding others in loving attention. So along with the O'Donovans, Rowan Williams looks at the idea of rights as duties. And space, I think we could learn our human rights theory and the way we treat human rights could learn a lot from what's going in space. We have this environment where, for example, one state must help an astronaut of another state if they're in need. So there's this idea of holding others in loving attention in space that we need to protect, and we could potentially reflect back in Earth. I think this is in stark contrast to some of the individualistic territorial approaches to interactions on Earth. So one thing that I'd be interested to discuss with you, and I think needs thinking through, is can we overcome factionalism to at least keep outer space as this safe space, this collaborative space, and how do we ensure that Earth actors are engaged and representative in that community? So it's not just the global north, and it's not just about state actors and including state actors, but we are looking about the capacity of for education and understanding that becomes democratic, plurally democratic. So my final concept then is stewardship, and the idea of taking care of, managing, but not owning. This is a biblical concept and comes from the idea that actually God, the divine, created the world, created us, we live in it. We don't own it, although legally we might have feel that we have rights of ownership. Actually, we're entrusted to be stewards for the time being of the earth. And of course, the big question there is, well, actually, does that mean the universe, or does that mean the earth? And how far does our faith then extend, and how far does that requirement for stewardship extend to the universe? And how far do we see that as under God's stewardship, so God's sustaining grace, and our role within that? And how much are we viewing what we do? So, for example, there's some research been undertaken on American astronauts who very much saw themselves as undertaking the divine, as well as the kind of frontier mentality, going out and exploring for humankind. They had a calling to do what they were doing. So there's some interesting ideas about stewardship there. So this is where some of the work of my wonderful colleague Thomas Cheney comes in, the idea that is Earth unique and a space or a resource to be exploited, or should we attribute value to space as an environment to be protected? And how do we get that balance? What do we do with the resources in space? So we can mine in space. It's very expensive at the moment, but likely to become less so. What about our satellites and scientific discovery? Are we really sharing it? Or are we starting to bite that apple and take the benefits back to our own states? There is some really interesting work going on. I won't go into detail now, but there's some interesting work going on around planetary protection and astro-environmental ethics. So the Committee on Space Research and Planetary Protection Policy. And I think one of my questions is, does and should our theology of stewardship inform astro-environmental ethics? And should that process be democratized? I think this is a hugely important question. And as I said, not democratized so that other state actors are included, but what about the voice of the people, as it were? Are we informing the virtue building that's going on around what's happening in space? So two big issues around space is the privatization of, and stewardship, is the privatization of space and space debris. So we already see some private missions being sent up, and here there's a kind of a mixture of public-private combined, because the state, even where a private mission goes up, the state still maintains responsibility for what's going on there. And we have potential for space mining, and some space mining is going on. But my proposal here for stewardship is that, or my question is, are we going to have a level of corporate social responsibility for commercial space projects? Corporate social responsibility, of course, requires the general public to put pressure on organizations in order for them to act in a corporately socially responsible way. So I think that's something that could be explored. I think also we might think about the theory of private property. There's a positive here. Thinking in the philosophy of property some thinking argues that individual agency leads to increased responsibility. So there might be a positive side. If we're going to let private organizations engage, what we might see is an increased responsibility. If we can engage that or combine that with CSR, we might see some real improvement there. So what I'd like you to think about in terms of my theological analysis when it comes to question time is, do you think we're about to bite the apple? Have we bitten the apple? Might we stop biting the apple and stay in the Garden of Eden? So that's some of the questions I would put, but that's my kind of theological perspective. What I'd like to do now, and I'm not going to spend too long on it because I'm conscious I'm coming up to time, is give a very brief overview of the legal landscape. So the jurisdiction in space is basically governed by, so jurisdiction means the extent to which law and legal authorities can control a given area or space or territory. So jurisdiction in space sits within international law. It's analogous to the law of the high seas. So the law of the high seas says there's freedom of the sea, right of passage through territorial waters, fishing rights, pollution management, rights of landlocked states. There's all sorts of rights that arise, but the territorial waters themselves, just like outer space, are an international zone. And there is, even within that, there are parts of it which are deemed to be common heritage of humankind. So the parts of the seabed, for example, and the parts of the moon are deemed to be common heritage of humankind. And there are laws relating to how those areas are to be treated. In terms of jurisdiction within space, the jurisdiction of a state attaches to individuals in space and to objects in space. So, for example, on the International Space Station, each state that's created part of the space station, their laws apply to that part of the space station. So if something goes wrong, they have to bear liability or they have to sort the problem out. But the individuals themselves also then carry the law of the state with them, which in law throws up some fascinating conflicts of laws issues, which are a bit beyond the scope of this presentation. But what we have within this framework, again, very briefly, we have this lovely module, wonderful module in law, which goes into much more detail about it. But we have a framework of 5 treaties, resolutions and declarations, which is predominantly Vienna law. So Vienna law is about the peaceful use of space. We also have some Geneva laws covering military uses and militarization of space. So as I said, states are responsible for private actors in space, which does give rise to the potential for control. And at some point, the analogy with the law of the sea doesn't completely work, because actually someone can get in a boat and get out to sea, so enjoy freedom of the sea, whereas it is not possible for someone to get in a spacecraft and go up to space. There's far more control there of what's going on. So one of the questions is there really freedom of space? Should there be freedom of space? And there are, of course, barriers to enjoyment of the freedom of space. So as a type of the freedom of space, because of the barriers to entry, the cost. The treaties that exist, and they were formed very early on when it was realized that the nuclear armament battle between America and Russia needed to not be taken into outer space. We have the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Space Liability Convention, Registration Convention, and the Moon Agreement, and then other rules relevant to satellite telecommunication. There are various levels of take-up. So the Outer Space Treaty, 111 signatories to that, whereas the Moon Agreement, far fewer there. So we have this framework of treaties, international law treaties, which is dependent on compliance. We don't have an outer space force which would go around, and it's not quite our Star Wars scenario where law is enforced in that way. There is a level to which international law between states has a form of diplomatic enforcement and engagement, and sits differently with compliance and regulation than national law does. What I'd like to do, though, is just briefly go over some of the principles to help us in our discussions about whether we think we have this legal Garden of Eden, this collaboration between states that happens in outer space but doesn't happen on Earth. So the exploration and use of outer space should be carried out for the benefit of humankind. Outer space should be free for exploration and use by all states, Outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. That's despite the fact that at least 3 American presidents have bought plots on the moon. There's this wonderful video you can find on YouTube with a lawyer explaining that they're not valid. States shall not place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies, or station them in outer space in any other manner. The moon and other celestial bodies should be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Astronauts should be regarded as the envoys of humankind. States should be responsible for national space activities, whether carried out by government or non-government entities. States should be liable for damage caused by their space objects, and states should avoid harmful contamination of space and celestial bodies. We can see already just a little bit more detail about some of the law. We have this Committee on Space Research, which is the Committee of the International Council for Science, which looks at protection and cleanup. So already we see the outworking of some of those broader principles and those broader treaties where an international NGO is establishing authoritative guidance on responsible behaviour for exploration. The Geneva Law, which is rules of international humanitarian law about the use of force and rules on how warfare is conducted, covers both the impact of what's going on in space on Earth and what can and cannot go on in space. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip on to a couple of concluding slides now. So one thing I think that needs thinking through, and I'd be really interested to discuss with you, is the idea of human rights in space. And there's 2 sides to this. So human rights on Earth are impacted by activities in space, and we can think of data protection, privacy, equity and equality, resource allocation and inclusion, just as some initial thoughts about that. Human rights in outer space, so the rights of astronauts, the rights of private passengers, which human rights would be relevant, how would they be enforceable? We have an idea about who they would be enforceable against, but how they would be enforceable is, I think, an important topic. So just to briefly go over an analysis and synthesis before we reach our discussions. I've just put a few thoughts down here. There are lots more rabbit holes to go down, if you like, but we can start our discussion with these thoughts, and I look forward to you building on and introducing new ideas. So in terms of prophecy, I think religious freedom and freedom of speech need enhanced protection in outer space. Quantum computing and AI and space particularly make this an urgent project, an urgent way forward. So otherwise, space can become dominated by government commercial agendas or machine agendas, which I think is, there's so much positive to the development of technology, but we must have a view to democratization of space. Looking at our concept of the Garden of Eden, I think we need to look at space as a precious resource and think about it as relational. So how are we relating in space as states and as individuals, and how can we build on that? If we're looking at it as something precious, can we give enhanced legal protection to space as an international space to withstand the pressures of commercialization and militarization? Thinking about democratization of space, I think this is beyond including other nation states. Do we need soft legal mechanisms to encourage understanding and buy-in from general populations? We could, I think, introduce CSR agendas, and that goes hand in hand with the grassroots democratization of space. In terms of community and stewardship, do we need additional soft international legal instruments to foster community and stewardship in space, to hold governments and corporations to account? And do we need to think the kind of colonization, appropriation of space, particularly for geostationary orbit? So I have some thoughts as well on the rule of law, which I'm happy to talk through. What we're seeing is the rule of law is a concept that applies to nation states what we're seeing is this idea of answerability and the building of community and relations within society. We are seeing the rule of law mechanisms brought into international law, and I think usefully that could be brought into outer space law. That is, I think, part of another presentation, because I really would love to hear some of your ideas now. So if I come back to the room, so I'm going to end the presentation and come back to the room. Let's see if I can do that. Here we go. How are we doing?
I think your screen is loading. Well, yeah, go here.
Great.
Well, thanks, Jessica, for this very, very rich presentation. And I think, you know, usually this is a perspective that we rarely get, particularly looking at how can theological or religious sort of thinking inform how we deal with things. And I like the extension you make here, particularly the concept of outer space. And it's novel. It's quite novel, because in most cases we always talk about, you know, we always think from this economic perspective, a geopolitical perspective, you know, but rarely do we bring in this ethical element of this, and I think it's quite helpful. So I think I'm just going to open the floor now, and if you have any questions, or if you have any comments, I think this is the time. And please, if possible, do put up your cameras and we can see each other here. Thanks. Do we have people here?
I think I might have sent everybody to sleep, Frangton. Who thinks we're about to bite the apple, or we have bitten the apple?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there is less. Please go ahead, Les.
Yeah, I'll fill the gap. Get things started. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I mean, I have somewhat followed these issues over 3 decades. These issues meaning the militarization of space in the broad sense, often with the euphemism security, which serves to turn everything, all potential conflicts, into threats to our security, as if we are the same as a nation state, dissolves that distinction. I mean, I noticed that also in the way you did the presentation. When you used the word we, it was unclear whether you meant nation states or citizens or some connection between them. So that's just a kind of caveat about how we use such words. But the more general question I want to pose is about agency, say, of citizens in some collective form. Because I have followed efforts by various civil society groups to elaborate critical perspectives on the militarization, or let's say securitization. And it's been very difficult for them even to be heard, much less to make any discernible difference. I mean, if we compare that with, say, war, states threatening or proposing to go to war and then going to war, I mean, there have been mass movements, millions of people protesting. I mean, sometimes that has made a difference eventually in deterring a war, or at least in ending it sooner than it might have ended. That's been difficult enough. But outer space seems even more elusive, you know, for any kind of collective citizens' agency to make a difference. So I suppose I'm posing that more general question in relation to what arguments would be more effective, because more effective in relation to what collective agency. That's my general question.
Super, yes, and so important. Thank you so much. Yes, I think there are so many different ways in. I think we think of outer space as a single issue, and it's just in my limited study of it, there are so many issues and so many different ways into engaging. And yes, importantly, militarization, or the unacceptable way in which space has been used for militarization, is an important one. But I wonder whether it's about understanding the different aspect and finding ways in. So finding ways of engaging. One of the biggest problems, I think, is the need for expertise in order to engage at certain levels. That's the thing I've noticed. So when I started to look at the intersection of space law and theology, I had to then start to familiarize myself with vast amounts of technical jargon, and not just technical, it's not technical jargon, it's technical words, but also it was like, it's not as bad as, but it was almost like coming to the OU. When you come to the OU, you have to look at the OU dictionary of all the acronyms that there are, and so it was almost like doing interdisciplinary work with yet another area to integrate. And so I think actually that's probably a barrier for a lot of people. So I don't know how many people are involved in the groups that you've worked with, Les?
I wouldn't say I've worked with them, but I've followed their efforts, and they range from critical expert NGOs to just individuals. It's been difficult to form a significant pressure group.
Yes. Yeah. So perhaps a combination of whether enough groups and enough people regard this as important as it is. I mean, it seems to me, having looked at it, that it's important as it is. But so I got into it, for example, when I heard my colleague Thomas Cheney give a presentation. It wasn't on my agenda. I heard him give a presentation, and then suddenly I thought, oh my word, there are all these different aspects of it and intersections with my own work. So part of it, and I know Giles Mohan had, I think, an education brief in relation to this, which is fantastic, is going out there to a wider audience to speak even more. A friend of mine, Ruth Valeria, has worked on sustainability, for example, for more than a decade. She's done fantastic work, but speaking to her recently, she said, actually, I've been talking for years about issues that are now only just on the agenda and becoming sort of top of some people's agenda and important. And it's the same with the COP meetings. There were many of them until actually it started to really hit national headlines and become important. And the sadness is that often these things hit the headlines at the point where it's too late. And something like this, perhaps it would be better to get ahead of the curve, as it were, to really play that prophetic role. So I think there is, especially for the OU, there is a huge role to be played in ensuring that there is this understanding. Blethen's book, Blethen Brown's book on original sin and militarization of space is fantastic, and it's hugely readable, actually. It took me back to my days of shutting myself in a room with my science fiction books. Although sadly it's not science fiction, not to draw an analogy of pleasure at the idea of militarization of space, but these sorts of things I think really help, and the OU is really well placed to engage in that process, and already has engaged in that process. Some of the open learn materials, but also putting material not just under science or not just under law, but putting it in front of audiences in a way which makes it really accessible. I think would then or even attaching it to agendas that are about stewardship and sustainability and climate change, and putting it, are we talking about this at the COP conferences? Are we talking about it when we talk about sustainability, that sort of thing. Does that present some hope into the what sounds like a frustrating situation?
Well, hope is a complex issue.
It is, yes, in and of itself, yes.
Well, thanks, Les, for the question, and Jessica for the response. I have Alessandra Marino. Please go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to try and push a bit more, Jessica, on this issue of like collaboration in space, because you have gone back to it a few times, and kind of your hunch is that there's more collaboration in space rather than on Earth, and that collaboration, like international collaboration on Earth, can learn from it. However, I would say that particularly from the Trump administration forward, the direction that the US has taken is probably the opposite, and to withdraw from international agreements to create their own bilateral agreements. And so particularly with reference to the governance kind of outer space, I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that. And relatedly, for example, the constitution of the Space Force is quite a worrying kind of development of that push of nationalistic ideals and nationalistic borders beyond the atmosphere. So for me, that is quite sort of a trend in the field. And yeah, I was just wondering if you wanted to say something about that.
Yes, thank you, Alessandra. Yes, I think there was a huge amount of undermining of that collaborative approach under the Trump administration, deeply worrying, absolutely. And of course, the problem is the resources that America has and the potential control it already has. For example, it owns a huge percentage of the satellites in geostationary orbit, and they are constellations of satellites. And I think it's deeply worrying. Whether that's a trend that's going to be continued, or whether that's something that we'll see America back down on, I think I would defer to international relations colleagues. One way of impacting that is this idea of democratization beyond state engagement, and is this idea of, if we can, getting many more people aware of, how many people know of the balance of power in space and how it could so easily tip, and whether we see that as another issue that needs to be far more on the national political agendas and international agendas of governments. So, but I completely agree with you. Yes, it's really, really worrying. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for this. Do we have any hands up? Yeah, it seems one wants to raise their hand. Maybe for now, maybe let me just take this opportunity to sort of maybe try to stretch you a little bit here, because you kind of indirectly refer to this idea of outer space as a commodity. I mean, I are looking at it from the concept of Garden of Eden, which is fine, but I think there's also a danger here of once outer space is commodified, comes with financialization, and absolutely, given the power imbalances in global politics, chances are those who are powerful enough will continue to reap the benefits of space exploration. So maybe thinking about, is commodifying outer space a best way of dealing with some of these challenges and questions that that face us?
Thanks, Frangton. Super question. So, yeah, so my colleague Thomas Cheney looks at this idea, first of all, of whether I think ethically we need to decide what outer space is. So is it actually for example, like a mine that we can exploit? You know, is it, and do we have that right, if you like, to do so? We being those states that have the power to do so, or humankind that's represented that those states that do so. And thank you, Les, for that comment about who we speak about when we talk about I and we. So yeah, so I think we have to think, and that goes back to my theological analysis of, you know, do we see the earth as that place that was provided for humankind, and actually we don't yet understand what we think about outer space. And some of that's to do with the potential. You know, the scientists, I think, understand the potentials or the futures of what might be outer space, and we need more of a meeting of those groups, if you like. So the ability of ethicists and theologians and philosophers to think through what outer space might be, and the scientists then to inform that with the actual potential that there is. I mean, I went to CERN a few years ago, and it was transformative. You know, it's phenomenal, and they explain the science so well. Even I could understand what was going on, and you know, this interrelationship between the what goes on Earth in its minutest form, and then what goes on in outer space. Absolutely amazing. And actually, I think we need to see that intersectionality, that interaction more, in order to think about what we regard as, what we see outer space as, and what we see our role as in respect of outer space. The danger is, as Bowen warns us, and as we've seen, especially with the trends in America, is that it becomes a place that can be used for domination on Earth, or it needs to be controlled. And I think there's so much more to it. You only have to listen to some of the scientific discovery programs made in conjunction with the OU about what we can discover about Mars and what that tells us about Earth, and what we can do. And I think also we need to look seriously at some of these ideas about moving into space. You know, could we move a group of people into space? Could they live there? Could they live on a planet? And if you think back, when I was doing some of the reading on quantum technology and AI, and some of the predictions that we could be facing the equivalent of an industrial revolution within the next 10 years. And I wonder how many people outside of science know of that, and I wonder what the impacts that's going to have, both on inequalities. So we have inequalities now on Earth, but the drastic inequalities that are going to arise because of technological capacity or incapacity moving forward, and the impact that'll have on our capacities in outer space. You know, there are so many things that I think would benefit from a deeper understanding from those who are ethicists and philosophers and governance experts, and bring the scientists in to explain what's going on, kind of thing.
Good. Do we have any hands up from the audience? I can't seem to find anyone raising.
Alessandra, thank you. Alessandra's just put that's brilliant. Just called that up. That's great. Wonderful.
Oh yeah, everyone is just.
I must talk to you about our book, Alessandra. That's fantastic. Yeah, it's just the sort of it's kind of bringing this to people's attentions, both in the academic world, but I think, as I say, I think academics have this prophetic role to speak also in other in other contexts, and it's setting patterns for that. I'm looking, for example, at setting up some public events. It wasn't on this particular issue, but it could be on this particular issue. And in fact, I think this particular issue would really excite, you know, some of those younger people still in school, in the upper sixth, or, you know, who are really into Star Wars or into all these, you know, these science fiction type things, who would come along because of that and then hear a lot more, but who still have that interest. You know, we have at school still this ability to have an interest across subjects, so they still, their minds are still able to make those links. But yeah, it's...
Okay. I think, given that no one is intending to ask any question, Heidi.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, if we've wrapped up with the questions, that's absolutely fine to finish a few minutes early. Thank you everyone for your contributions and your questions, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks. Well, goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Alessandra, thank you so much for that link.